At my brother's wedding, I heard my parents plot to give my $650,000 beach house to my golden child brother. The next day, I quietly sold it and the house they lived in rent-free. They never saw it coming. They thought I was inside the ballroom, mingling with relatives and pretending to enjoy myself. When my mother lowered her voice and told my brother, "We'll force him to transfer the deed. The beach house will be yours, Trenton. He owes this family." They were planning to take the $650,000 property I had worked 80-hour weeks to afford and hand it to their precious golden child. The next morning, I began arranging the sale of that beach house. While I was at it, I also decided to sell the $300,000 house my parents were living in rent-free. They never saw it coming. The champagne flowed through the reception hall, while a string quartet played beneath crystal chandeliers. Golden light reflected from polished floors, expensive dresses, and glasses raised in celebration. It was the perfect night for my older brother, Trenton, and his new wife, Blair. Everything about the evening suggested wealth, success, and family unity, but it was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion. I was 28 years old and worked as a freelance cybersecurity consultant. Most of my life was spent in front of computer screens, searching for hidden vulnerabilities, tracing digital footprints, and neutralizing threats before they could cause permanent damage. I had built my career without help from my family, because I had learned early that relying on them was a guaranteed path to disappointment. I had always been the invisible child. Trenton was the golden boy. At 32, he described himself as a serial entrepreneur. In reality, he had launched one failed business after another. Each new venture arrived with dramatic promises, borrowed money, and speeches about how he was one investor away from becoming a millionaire. Within a year, each business collapsed. Somehow, none of those failures were ever his fault. According to my parents, Garrison and Karen, Trenton was a misunderstood genius surrounded by people who failed to appreciate his vision. That night, I stepped onto the wraparound balcony because the ballroom had become suffocating. I needed a break from the heat, the noise, and the fake smiles I had been wearing for hours. The air outside was cool and smelled faintly of ocean salt and expensive perfume. I leaned against the stone railing, slowly turning the amber liquid in my glass and calculating how much longer I had to stay before I could leave without causing another family argument. A few yards away, a heavy glass door slid open. I could not see who had stepped outside because a massive floral arrangement blocked my view, but I recognized my mother's voice immediately. It was sharp, calculating, and coated in the artificial sweetness she always used when she wanted something. "Trenton, honey, stop worrying about the startup debt," she said. "You need to focus on Blair and the honeymoon." Trenton released a long, miserable sigh. He had perfected the sound of a victim being crushed by circumstances no one else could possibly understand. "I can't help it, Mom. The investors are breathing down my neck. Blair wants to start looking at houses in the gated community, but my credit is wrecked. I don't know where we're going to live when we get back." Then my father spoke, his deep voice as dismissive as ever. "I told you, son, we have it handled. Your brother has that enormous beach house sitting empty half the year. It's ridiculous for a single man to hoard a property like that while his family is in need." My heart skipped, then began pounding against my ribs. I pressed my back against a cold stone pillar and held my breath. "Exactly," my mother said. "Next week, we'll invite him over for dinner. I'll have the deed transfer papers prepared. We'll sit him down and make it clear that he owes this family. We gave him life. We raised him. Giving you that house is the least he can do to support his brother. It's the perfect place for you and Blair to begin your family." "What if Kieran says no?" Trenton asked. "You know how selfish he gets about his money." "He won't say no," my father replied with a dark chuckle. "He never puts up a real fight. We'll lay the guilt on thick. We'll tell him my heart condition is acting up again. We'll tell him he's destroying the family if he refuses. We'll force him to transfer the deed." My mother's voice softened into something almost triumphant. "Don't worry about anything, Trenton. That beach house is yours." A cold, paralyzing silence settled over me. I did not storm toward them. I did not shout or throw my glass against the wall. I simply stood there, hidden behind the flowers and stonework, while condensation made the glass slippery in my hand. My parents were not merely favoring my brother. They were actively conspiring to take the largest asset I owned and use it to reward him for another round of failures. They had already decided that my work, my sacrifices, and my property belonged to them. They believed I was too weak to stop them. I pulled out my phone, opened the voice memo application, and recorded the final part of their conversation. I captured my father promising that they would force me to sign. I captured my mother assuring Trenton that the property was already his. I captured the sound of their glasses clinking as they celebrated the theft of a house they had never paid for. A bitter smile formed on my face. They wanted to play a ruthless game. They were about to discover what happened when they cornered someone whose entire career depended on identifying threats and dismantling hostile systems. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and highway lines. I kept the radio off, but the silence inside the car was deafening. Their conversation had been the match, but the explosives had been accumulating for more than 2 decades. My life contained an entire museum of injustice, filled with memories in which I was always placed last. One of the clearest was my college graduation. I had worked 2 jobs while completing a difficult computer science degree. I graduated near the top of my class and bought my parents good seats for the ceremony. I also reserved a table at an expensive steakhouse because I wanted one evening when they would be proud of me. I waited outside the auditorium in my cap and gown while families gathered around the other graduates. Parents took photographs. Siblings carried flowers. People laughed and cried and wrapped their arms around one another. My family never arrived. When I finally called, my mother answered with a distracted sigh. "Oh, Kieran, we're so sorry. Trenton had a championship game for his amateur volleyball league. He really needed our support. You know how anxious he gets. You understand, right? We'll take you out for burgers next week." They never did. I ate a microwave dinner alone in my cramped dorm room, holding my diploma in one hand and a cheap plastic fork in the other. Then there was the $15,000 car fund. When I was 21, I spent 3 years saving every spare dollar for a reliable used truck. I needed it to commute to my first real technology job. 2 days before I planned to visit the dealership, my father called in a panic. Trenton had attempted to start a luxury pet grooming business. He had borrowed money at terrible interest rates, and his creditors were threatening to seize what little equipment he owned. My father drove to my apartment, looked me directly in the eyes, and said that if I refused to transfer my savings to Trenton, I would be tearing the family apart. I argued. I shouted. I told them I needed the vehicle for work. My mother began crying and said Trenton was fragile. She suggested that the pressure might cause him to do something drastic. By the time they finished, they had made me feel as though keeping my own savings would make me responsible for anything that happened to him. I transferred the $15,000. 3 months later, Trenton bought a new jet ski. I rode the bus for 2 more years. The greatest example of their entitlement was the house they currently occupied. 4 years earlier, my parents had filed for bankruptcy. My father had co-signed a loan for another one of Trenton's brilliant ventures, a custom skateboard company that collapsed after 6 months. The bank foreclosed on my parents' family home, and they were facing the possibility of having nowhere to live. By then, I was doing well in cybersecurity. I accepted enormous corporate contracts and worked until my eyes burned. I used my savings to buy a comfortable $300,000 craftsman house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The deed was entirely in my name, but I allowed my parents to move in without paying rent. I covered the property taxes and insurance. They were responsible only for their utilities. They never gave me a genuine thank you. Within a month, my mother complained that the kitchen cabinets were an ugly shade of gray and demanded that I pay a contractor to replace them. When I refused, she called me cheap. My father changed the locks on the garage and informed me that I could not store my spare server equipment there because Trenton needed the space for old college furniture. They treated the house as if they owned it. They treated me like an irritating landlord trespassing on their property. I had given them a roof when they had nothing. Their response was to scheme behind my back and take the rest of what I had built. When I reached my apartment, I remained inside my car and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. They saw me as the quiet, conflict-avoidant son who would eventually surrender. They had forgotten that my profession involved studying hostile networks, identifying vulnerabilities, and neutralizing threats before the enemy realized I had entered the system. My family had become a hostile network. It was time for a system wipe. First, however, I needed them to believe their plan was working perfectly. I had to smile, remain cooperative, and continue playing the victim they thought they understood. The morning after the wedding, the family gathered for a post-reception brunch at an expensive country club. It was one of those traditions designed to keep the celebration going. And naturally, I was expected to attend and quietly pay part of the bill. I entered the bright dining room wearing a calm expression that concealed the storm inside my head. Trenton and Blair sat at the center of the long table, opening the final wedding envelopes. My parents were positioned beside them like loyal guards. When I approached, the conversation stopped for a fraction of a second. Then my mother arranged her face into a bright, artificial smile. "Kieran, you made it. We barely saw you last night." "I was around," I replied as I pulled out a chair across from my father. I was taking in the atmosphere. Congratulations again, Trenton. Thanks, man, he mumbled without looking away from the card in his hands. A waitress poured coffee. Silverware clinked against china. Then the performance began exactly as it had been planned on the balcony. My father cleared his throat and rubbed his chest with an exaggerated grimace. This indigestion is killing me, he announced. Maybe it's the stress. My blood pressure has been through the roof. My mother immediately placed a hand on his shoulder and looked at me with wide, worried eyes. Your father hasn't been sleeping well, Kieran. The doctor says he needs peace and quiet. The wedding was beautiful, but it was exhausting. Now we also have to worry about where Trenton and Blair are going to live. It's too much for an older man's heart. I kept my expression neutral and took a slow drink of black coffee. Is that so? I'm sure Trenton and Blair will work something out. They're adults. Blair released a theatrical sigh and rested her head on Trenton's shoulder. It's so difficult in this market. We want to start trying for a baby soon. The thought of bringing a newborn into a cramped apartment is terrifying. The audacity was breathtaking. They were reciting the guilt trip almost word for word, exactly as they had planned. My mother leaned forward and fixed her eyes on mine. Actually, Kieran, since you mentioned it, I was thinking about your beach house. I placed my cup on the table. What about it? You hardly ever go there, and it sits empty collecting dust. I'd like to drive up this weekend, hire cleaners, air out the rooms, and check the plumbing. The salt air can be terrible for the exterior. I only want to make certain the asset is protected. She did not care about maintenance. She wanted access. She wanted to begin moving Trenton's belongings into the guest rooms, change the locks, and establish his presence before they presented me with the transfer documents. That's thoughtful of you, I said smoothly. The property management company handles the maintenance, so you don't need to trouble yourself. Nonsense, my father snapped, striking his palm lightly against the table. Family takes care of family property. Your mother is offering free labor. Give her the spare key and stop being ungrateful. The table became silent. Trenton watched me from the corner of his eye. Blair held her breath. My mother extended one manicured hand, her fingers twitching with anticipation. I reached into my pocket. My hand brushed against my real keychain, then closed around the object I had prepared before leaving home. It was an old brass key from a junk drawer, belonging to a padlock I had thrown away months earlier. I dropped the useless key into my mother's palm. You're right, I said with a warm smile. I appreciate you looking after the property. Be careful on the drive. There has been construction along the coastal highway. Her fingers closed around the key like a hawk seizing prey. Of course, sweetheart. This is what family is about. I finished my coffee, excused myself, and walked toward the restroom. Near the exit, I glanced into a large decorative mirror. In the reflection, my mother held the key up for Trenton to see while whispering excitedly. They were celebrating a victory that did not exist. 2 days later, their behavior moved beyond emotional manipulation and entered felony territory. I was working from my home office, concentrating on a complicated security audit for a corporate client, when my phone vibrated. The caller was Judson, my closest friend since middle school. He was loud, fiercely loyal, and knew almost every dark detail about my family. He had stopped at the house where my parents lived to retrieve a circular saw my father had borrowed and never returned. Are you busy? Judson asked. His voice was unusually low. I'm configuring a firewall. What happened? Did my father try to charge you rent for your own saw? No. Listen carefully, Kieran. I'm standing in your parents' dining room. Your mother went outside to speak with the gardener. There's a pile of mail and folders on the table. I accidentally knocked over a manila envelope while reaching for the saw, and the papers spilled out. I stopped typing. Why are you whispering? Because one of the documents has your name on it. It's a preliminary mortgage application stamped by a private lending company. Kieran, it's a cash-out refinance application for the beach house. The blood drained from my face. My office suddenly felt freezing. What did you say? They're trying to pull equity out of your property. The signature on the borrower line resembles your handwriting, but it's shaky. It's forged. Your parents are committing mortgage fraud. My vision narrowed, and a loud ringing filled my ears. I had known they intended to pressure me into surrendering the deed. I had not realized they were also attempting to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars from the property before taking it. They planned to drain the equity, hand the empty shell to Trenton, and leave me legally responsible for a fraudulent loan. Photograph everything, I told Judson. My voice became frighteningly calm. Take a clear picture of every page. Turn off the flash. Don't remove anything. And put the documents back in the exact order you found them. I heard the quiet clicking of his phone camera. I have them. I'm putting everything back. Your mother is coming inside. I'll send the pictures to your encrypted email. The call ended. Less than a minute later, my laptop chimed. I opened the encrypted folder and examined the high-resolution images. The application requested a $250,000 cash-out refinance against my $650,000 property. At the bottom of the final page was a pathetic imitation of my signature. My mother had always been good at copying handwriting. When I was a child, she occasionally wrote school notes that looked as if they had come from someone else. This time, she had used that skill on a financial document. This was no longer family manipulation. It was a serious crime. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The rage inside me was no longer hot. It had become cold, precise, and absolute. They did not merely view me as a source of money. They considered me acceptable collateral damage. They were willing to destroy my credit, damage my financial future, and place me in legal jeopardy so Trenton could pay his debts and decorate a beach house he had not earned. They assumed I would discover the loan later, cry, protest, and eventually absorb the consequences as I had absorbed every previous blow. I reached for my phone and called the number I kept for emergencies. It rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. Callahan Law Group, Arthur Callahan speaking. Arthur, this is Kieran. I need an emergency consultation today. What kind of emergency? Real estate fraud, forgery, and the immediate off-market liquidation of 2 residential properties. I'm going to sell everything. I need it done quietly enough that the people living in one of the houses do not learn about it until the transaction is complete. Callahan paused. Bring everything you have to my office at 2. I ended the call and looked out the window. The sky was clear and brilliantly blue. It was a beautiful day to begin a war. Arthur Callahan did not resemble a typical real estate attorney. He had the heavy build of a retired boxer, wore suits that were slightly out of fashion, and possessed a stare sharp enough to cut glass. His office smelled of strong coffee and old paper, and the walls were lined with thick legal volumes. I sat across from his mahogany desk while he examined the photographs Judson had taken. His jaw tightened when he reached the forged signature. This is amateur work, but it's dangerous, he said. Some private lenders move preliminary applications quickly and delay strict verification until the final closing stage. If this had progressed, untangling the fraud could have taken years and cost you a fortune. They're inviting me to dinner next week, I explained. They intend to pressure me into signing the deed over to Trenton. They want the refinance money, and they want him to receive the physical property. Callahan leaned back and tapped a gold pen against his desk. What are your instructions? Do you want criminal charges filed immediately? I can contact a detective. With this evidence, they could be facing an investigation by tomorrow. I shook my head. Not yet. An immediate arrest would be too simple. My mother would cry and call it a misunderstanding. She would claim she was organizing paperwork for me. Trenton would pretend he knew nothing. My extended family would call me a monster for having my elderly parents arrested over a document. I placed 2 thick folders on his desk. They contained the original deeds, title insurance records, and tax documents for both properties. I want to remove the comfort and entitlement they actually care about. Sell the beach house immediately, then sell the craftsman house they live in. Both deeds are solely in my name. There is no lease. They pay no rent and live there as month-to-month tenants at will. For the first time, surprise broke through Callahan's controlled expression. You want to sell the house from beneath them? Yes. Find cash buyers. I'll accept below-market offers if they guarantee closing in less than 10 days. No public listings, no open houses, and no signs on either property. I want the transactions completed in silence. Once the money clears, the new owners can serve the notices to vacate. Callahan studied me for several seconds. Then a slow, dangerous smile appeared. I know 2 private real estate investment groups that buy properties as is for cash. We can avoid the public market. I'll prepare non-disclosure agreements requiring complete silence until the transfers are recorded. However, you must keep your family distracted. If they suspect anything and push their fraudulent application forward, the lender could place a cloud on the title and delay the sale. Leave the distraction to me. After leaving his office, I drove to a small hardware store owned by my uncle Tobias. He was my father's younger brother and the black sheep of their generation. Tobias was quiet, practical, and hardworking. He had watched my parents exploit me for years, and he was the only relative who consistently remembered my birthday. I found him in a back aisle organizing power drills. He wiped his hands on a rag and smiled. Kieran, what brings you here? I need a favor, Uncle Toby. I need you to keep my parents busy for the next 7 days. His eyebrows drew together. What have Garrison and Karen done now? I showed him the photographs of the forged application. Confusion disappeared from his face, and was replaced by disgust. He gripped the edge of a metal shelf until his knuckles cracked. "Those greedy vultures," he growled. "They did this to their own son after you gave them a home? I'm selling both houses, the beach house and the one they're living in. I need time for the paperwork to clear without them contacting the lender or searching through my affairs." Tobias looked into my eyes, and fierce pride appeared in his tired face. "Good for you. Burn the whole arrangement down. I'll tell your father I'm considering an expansion and need his business expertise. I'll invent property listings and meetings several towns away. I'll drag both of them around all week. They won't have enough time to breathe, much less commit more fraud." We shook hands, sealing an agreement between the only two sane men in our bloodline. The machinery was in motion. The trap was ready. All I needed to do was enter the lion's den and continue pretending I was prey. The invitation arrived in a sugary text from my mother on Wednesday morning. "Kieran, honey, we're making your favorite roast beef on Saturday. Trenton and Blair will be here. We need to have a serious family discussion. Please don't be late. Love you." I read it while looking at an email from Callahan. One investment group had agreed to buy the beach house for $610,000. Another buyer would purchase the Craftsman house for $280,000. The prices were below market value, but both offers were cash, with no financing contingencies and no public marketing. The final documents were scheduled to close before their Saturday dinner. "I'll be there, Mom. Looking forward to it," I replied, adding a smiling emoji. Saturday evening arrived beneath heavy rain. The suburban streets shone like dark glass as I pulled into the driveway of the house I had purchased for my parents. I sat behind the wheel and took one slow breath. Showtime. When I entered, the smell of roasting meat and the sound of forced laughter filled the house. The living room was immaculate. Trenton and Blair sat on the sofa, drinking expensive red wine that my father had probably charged to a credit card he could barely afford. "Kieran," my father announced, giving me a stiff pat on the back. "Good to see you, son. Come inside." We gathered in the dining room, where the table had been set with the good china. During dinner, everyone behaved with suffocating politeness. My parents asked about my work and nodded with fake interest. Blair discussed an expensive interior designer she followed online. Trenton boasted about his upcoming application launch. I ate, smiled, and played the oblivious son. When the dessert plates were cleared, the atmosphere changed. My mother folded her napkin, drew a careful breath, and gave Trenton a sorrowful look. "We invited you tonight because the family is facing a crisis, Kieran." I placed my fork down and widened my eyes. "What happened? Is Dad's health all right?" My father sighed and placed one hand over his chest exactly as planned. "My heart is holding up, but the stress is killing me. Trenton and Blair are in a terrible position. The housing market is unstable, and the investors for Trenton's app company delayed their funding. Without help, they may be forced into a small apartment in an unsafe neighborhood." Trenton stared at the table and rubbed his temples. "I feel like a failure. I only want to provide a good life for my future children." It was an expertly rehearsed manipulation. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "But what does it have to do with me?" My mother reached beneath the table and produced a thick leather folder. She opened it and pushed several legal documents toward me. On top was a quitclaim deed. "We know your beach house spends most of the year empty," she said. Her sorrowful tone became demanding almost instantly. "You're single. You work from a laptop. You don't need a $650,000 vacation property. Trenton needs a primary residence. We've prepared everything for you to transfer the deed to him." I looked at the paperwork. "You want me to give him a house I spent years paying for?" "Family requires sacrifice," my father snapped as his friendly mask cracked. "Do you have any idea how much we sacrificed to raise you? You earn more money than you need. Trenton requires a foundation. Stop being selfish." I turned toward my brother. "Do you agree with this? You actually want to take my house?" "It isn't taking," Trenton replied, puffing out his chest. "It's keeping assets in the family. Mom and Dad said you owe us. Besides, you're in cybersecurity. You make plenty of money. I'm an entrepreneur. My wealth is tied up in future equity. Sign the paper and stop making this difficult." They believed the trap had closed around me. If I refused, they would call me the villain who destroyed the family. If I agreed, they would receive my largest asset and whatever money they could steal through the refinance application. I touched the edge of the deed and allowed my hand to tremble. "This is a lot to process," I stammered. "It's my largest asset. I can't sign it over while eating chocolate cake." My mother's eyes narrowed. "There's nothing to process. Your brother's future is at stake." "Please, Mom, Ongji." I stood abruptly and made myself appear overwhelmed. "Give me 1 week. I need to speak with my accountant and understand the tax consequences." I promise I'll return next Saturday, and we'll settle everything. I only need a week. My father grumbled, but Trenton placed a hand on my mother's arm. 1 week is fine. Next Saturday, bring a pen. I nodded, took my coat, and hurried through the front door. They remained at the table, smug and confident. They believed they had broken me. Sitting in my car beneath the pouring rain, I opened my banking application. An incoming wire transfer showed a balance of $890,000. The transactions had closed. I no longer owned the beach house. I no longer owned the roof above my parents' heads. The following week felt like walking through a suffocating fog. Every time my phone vibrated, my body tightened. My mother sent several messages each day, gradually abandoning her loving parent performance and speaking more like an aggressive debt collector. On Tuesday, she reminded me that loyalty was not optional because blood created obligations. On Thursday, Trenton sent a link to a luxury interior design catalog. He wrote that Blair was excited to renovate the beach house's main bathroom. He even asked whether I would leave my expensive espresso machine in the kitchen when I moved my belongings out. I answered every message with short, agreeable replies. I said I was gathering documents. I said I wanted to put the tension behind us. I performed the role of a defeated, submissive son perfectly. Behind the scenes, everything moved quickly. Callahan made certain the title transfers were properly recorded. The $890,000 was moved into a secure trust account my family did not know existed. The buyer of the Craftsman House was Apex Property Holdings, a corporate management group interested only in its investment portfolio. Its representatives did not care about family history, tiers, or promises. They had purchased a property occupied by non-paying tenants, and they wanted those occupants removed lawfully and quickly. On Friday evening, I met Tobias at a quiet diner outside town. He slid into the booth looking exhausted but satisfied. He had spent the week dragging my father to empty commercial lots, imaginary meetings, and pointless inspections. Garrison had been kept far from lenders, mailboxes, and legal records. "It's finished," I told him, and pushed a plain black envelope across the table. "I wanted to make certain you were taken care of before tomorrow." Tobias opened the envelope and found a cashier's check for $25,000. His eyes widened, and he immediately pushed it back. "Absolutely not. I didn't help you for money. I helped because what they did was sick. Consider it an early retirement gift, or a repayment for all the money my father borrowed from you and never returned. You're the only person in this family who ever treated me like I mattered. Please take it." He stared at the check until his eyes became glassy. Finally, he folded it and placed it in his canvas jacket. "You're a good man, Kieran. Better than your father ever was. Be careful tomorrow. When people like them lose control, they become vicious. I know, but they have no power left to hurt me." On Saturday morning, I prepared my final presentation. I bought an expensive black leather portfolio, the kind someone might use while transferring a valuable piece of real estate. Inside, I arranged several documents. The first was a high-resolution color photograph of the fraudulent loan application, with my forged signature circled in red. The second was a legally prepared notice from Apex Property Holdings requiring Garrison and Karen to vacate the Craftsman House within 30 days or face formal eviction. The third was a notice concerning the beach property, making it clear that Trenton had no ownership rights and was not permitted to occupy it. I dressed in a tailored dark blue suit with a crisp white shirt and no tie. I wanted to look composed, successful, and untouchable. When I studied myself in the mirror, the invisible sun was gone. The overlooked family stepping stone had disappeared. In his place stood the architect of their collapse. As I drove toward the house I had purchased to save my parents from homelessness, my phone rang. Callahan's voice came through the speakers. "Everything is prepared. I'll be parked nearby. Once you send the signal, I'll enter. A civil standby unit is waiting a few blocks away in case anyone becomes violent." "Thank you, Arthur. I'll contact you when the trap closes." Trenton's leased luxury SUV was parked partly on the lawn when I arrived, tearing into grass I once paid landscapers to maintain. The porch light cast a warm, welcoming glow that felt almost insulting. I stepped from the car with the black portfolio in my hand and climbed the concrete stairs. They believed I was arriving to surrender my life. They had no idea they were about to open a bomb. I knocked twice. My mother opened the door immediately, practically glowing with anticipation. She wore an expensive silk blouse and a predatory smile. "Kieran, darling, come inside." She pulled me into a tight, false embrace. I entered with my face calm and unreadable. The smell of garlic and roasted lamb filled the rooms. The dining table was arranged even more lavishly than the previous week. Trenton sat at the head, tapping on his phone with a smug expression. Blair swirled sparkling water in a glass and looked as if she had already won a lottery. My father stood near the table carving meat. There he is, Garrison declared, pointing the carving knife toward me. The man of the hour. Sit down. We'll eat, then handle the business. I did not sit. I walked to the opposite end of the table and stood behind a high-backed chair. Then I placed the black leather portfolio on the polished surface. The dull impact echoed through the suddenly quiet room. I think we should handle the business first, I said. I have a busy evening. Trenton tossed his phone onto the table. Eager to do the right thing? Good. Mom, get him a pen. Let's sign the deed so Blair and I can start planning the move. My mother hurried to the kitchen and returned with a heavy gold fountain pen. She pushed it toward me. Sign on the dotted line, sweetheart. Then all this family tension can disappear. I left the pen untouched. Instead, I unzipped my portfolio, removed the documents face down, and slid them along the table until they stopped beside my mother's wine glass. I didn't bring the quitclaim deed. I brought something more important. Read it aloud. Her eyebrows drew together. She lifted the first page and examined the banking terminology. Then her gaze reached the forged signature circled in red. The color vanished from her face. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. What is it? My father demanded. Stop staring and tell us what he brought. My mother dropped the page as though it had burned her fingers. Where did you get this? She whispered. I looked at my father. That is a cash-out refinance application requesting $250,000 against my beach house. Someone submitted it using a forged version of my signature. Mortgage fraud, identity theft, and the use of fraudulent financial documents can carry severe federal penalties. Trenton's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. What are you talking about? Nobody forged anything. You're being paranoid. Keep reading, Mom. Read the next page. My mother's hands trembled as she lifted the second document. Notice to vacate, she read, her voice barely audible. Garrison and Karen, you are hereby provided 30 days' notice to vacate the premises. She stopped and struggled for breath. What does this mean? Why does it say we have to leave? This is our house. No, Mom. It was my house. I purchased it. I paid the taxes and insurance. I allowed you to live here because I didn't want my parents to be homeless. But that wasn't enough. You also wanted my beach house, and you were willing to commit fraud to steal the equity. I leaned forward and rested my knuckles on the table. So I solved the problem. For 3 long seconds, no one moved. I sold the beach house. I also sold this house. You no longer have a landlord who is your son. You have a corporate property management company that expects you to leave its investment within 30 days. The reaction was immediate. Blair screamed and dropped her glass. It shattered across the rug. Trenton's face turned dark red, and a vein rose in his forehead. My father dropped the carving knife onto the serving platter. You sold it? He roared. You sold the house we live in? You ungrateful piece of trash? I'll sue you. I'll take every dollar you received. You can't throw us into the street. He stepped toward me with his fists clenched. Trenton moved around the table as though he intended to tackle me. Their entitlement had shattered, and what remained was uncontrolled rage. I did not retreat. I removed my phone, pressed one button, and sent the prepared signal. You want to discuss lawsuits and courts? Perfect. I brought someone who can explain your legal position. Before anyone responded, 3 heavy knocks struck the front door. Trenton froze. My father stopped moving. Open it, I said while adjusting my cuffs. It would be rude to leave our guests standing in the rain. Trenton swallowed and walked toward the foyer. When he opened the door, Arthur Callahan stood on the porch in a charcoal suit. 2 uniformed police officers from the civil standby unit waited behind him. Callahan entered without hesitation. His gaze swept across the shattered glass, my sobbing mother, and my father's clenched fists. Good evening. I'm Arthur Callahan, managing partner of Callahan Law Group. I represent Kieran in matters concerning his real estate holdings and personal security. My father attempted to recover his authority. You have no right to enter my house. I'm calling my lawyer. This boy is attempting an illegal eviction. Callahan gave a dry, humorless laugh and lifted the notice from the table. First, Garrison, this is not your house. It belongs to Apex Property Holdings. Second, you are not being illegally evicted. You have been given 30 days notice, which complies with the requirements for month-to-month occupants without a formal lease. Trenton pointed at me. He promised the properties to this family. He can't sell them beneath us. We had a verbal contract. Callahan turned his cold stare toward him. A verbal promise involving the transfer of real estate does not give you ownership. You have no signed contract, no deed, no financial contribution, and no legal interest in either property. Then he opened his briefcase and removed a thick binder. What does have legal significance is this. He placed a certified copy of the refinance application on the table. My client discovered that Garrison and Karen attempted to obtain a $250,000 loan against his property by using a forged signature. The records include the submitted documents and a traceable digital footprint. My father's face went pale. His aggression disappeared. "We didn't forge anything," he stammered. "We were only preparing documents for him to review." "You submitted the application to a lender," Callahan replied. "That changes it from preparation into evidence of attempted fraud. The material can be delivered to investigators and prosecutors at any time." My mother released a high, desperate wail. "Please, Kieran, we're your family. How can you do this to us?" I walked to her side of the table and looked down at her. "How can I do this to you? You tried to put hundreds of thousands of dollars of fraudulent debt in my name. You planned to manipulate me into giving away a house I worked 80 hours a week to afford so your favorite child could pretend to be wealthy. You pushed me into a corner. I decided to destroy the corner." Blair suddenly stood and stared at Trenton in disgust. "You told me the beach house was guaranteed. You said your brother owed it to you. You lied to me. Your family is committing crimes." "Blair, please," Trenton begged, reaching for her arm. "We'll figure it out. My application launches next month. We'll have money." "Don't touch me. I'm not becoming involved in your family's financial crimes." She seized her designer purse, cast a frightened glance at the officers, and walked out. The front door slammed behind her. Trenton looked as if he had been struck by a vehicle. His marriage, his future home, and the life built on my sacrifices were collapsing in front of him. He sank into a chair and lowered his head onto the table. Callahan closed the binder with a sharp snap. "Here are the terms. My client is showing more restraint than the circumstances require. If Garrison and Karen leave this property within 30 days, return it in clean condition, refrain from damaging it, and stop contacting or harassing Kieran, the fraud evidence will remain secured with our firm. If they damage the property, refuse to leave, threaten my client, or attempt another fraudulent transaction, the documents will be delivered to law enforcement immediately." My father leaned against the wall, defeated. The man who had bullied me for my entire life had become a frightened, trembling shell. My mother could not meet my eyes. Trenton remained folded over the table. I returned the empty portfolio to my hand. "Have a good life," I said, "and good luck packing." I walked through the front door with Callahan and the officers behind me. Cool rain touched my face. For the first time in 28 years, I took a breath that felt entirely my own. The next 30 days became a lesson in how quickly a toxic family structure could collapse once its financial foundation disappeared. I did not witness every moment, but the consequences reached me anyway. By the 5th day, my phone was filled with calls and messages from aunts, uncles, and distant cousins. My mother had told them that her cruel, heartless son had suddenly lost his mind, sold the family home out of spite, and thrown his elderly parents into the street. Aunt Linda left a 3-minute message calling me a monster and demanding that I cancel the sale. I did not answer. I did not need to. On the 7th day, the family group chat reached a peak of outrage. That was when Tobias intervened. He uploaded the photographs of the forged refinance application, including the page containing my falsified signature. Beneath them, he wrote one message. "Before anyone calls Kieran a monster again, understand that Garrison and Karen attempted to obtain a $250,000 loan using his identity. He sold his properties to protect himself. Anyone who wants to defend them is welcome to let Garrison forge their signature next." The group chat went silent. No aunt, uncle, or cousin contacted me to complain again. 2 days later, Aunt Linda sent a quiet apology and blocked my parents' phone numbers. The social isolation my parents feared became their reality. Trenton's life unraveled even faster. Without the promise of a free beach house supporting his illusion of success, Blair withdrew from the marriage. Before they had been married for 2 months, she filed for an annulment, citing hidden financial problems and irreconcilable differences. Trenton attempted to launch his new application to prove everyone wrong. What he had never admitted was that my parents had repeatedly pressured me into covering his server expenses. I stopped those payments the morning after the dinner. His platform crashed on launch day. Without investors, free housing, or family money, he was forced to accept a low-paying data entry job to cover penalties connected to his broken commercial lease. The golden child had lost his golden safety net and finally faced the world without someone else absorbing every consequence. As the eviction deadline approached, my parents understood that Callahan's warning had not been a bluff. Representatives from Apex Property Holdings inspected the exterior of the house several times and made it clear that formal eviction proceedings would begin the moment the deadline expired. My parents' credit had been destroyed by bankruptcy and years of poor decisions. No relatives offered to take them in after Tobias exposed the fraud. Eventually, they rented a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment near the industrial district. It was a dramatic fall from the clean suburban home they had treated as their personal possession. On the 29th day, I drove past the Craftsman house one final time. I parked down the street beneath the shadow of a large oak tree. Trenton looked exhausted and disheveled as he struggled to load a cheap mattress into a rented moving truck. My father stood on the porch shouting at him for moving too slowly. My mother carried a plastic container filled with inexpensive kitchenware, her face miserable. There was no beach house waiting for them. There was no endless supply of my money to repair their mistakes. They had attempted to push me into a financial grave and had dug one for themselves instead. I watched the moving truck pull away, leaving the Craftsman house empty. 5 minutes later, an Apex representative arrived, walked to the front door, and changed the locks. It was finished. I put my car into gear, turned on the radio, and drove away from the ghosts of my old life. 6 months later, my existence was almost unrecognizable. I used part of the proceeds from the two sales to relocate across the country to a vibrant, technology-focused city where the climate was mild and mountains met the ocean. I purchased a modern loft overlooking the skyline. It was smaller than the beach house, but it belonged entirely to me. There were no ghosts in its rooms. My mother was not complaining about the kitchen cabinets. My father was not demanding garage space for someone else's failed business. Trenton was not waiting to claim whatever I achieved next. I invested some of the remaining money into expanding my cybersecurity practice. Without the constant mental burden of my family, my productivity increased dramatically. I hired 2 junior analysts, secured 3 large international contracts, and doubled my income within months. Success became easier when I stopped carrying people who treated my achievements as resources they were entitled to harvest. I still spoke with Tobias every Sunday. He used the $25,000 to renovate his hardware store and take a month-long fishing trip to Alaska, something he had wanted to do for more than a decade. He occasionally gave me family updates, although I rarely asked. My parents remained miserable in their apartment near the industrial district. My father attempted to begin another business importing nutritional supplements, but without my credit or money supporting him, he could not obtain financing. My mother spent her days complaining on social media, though her list of friends steadily decreased. Trenton moved into their second bedroom after his annulment became final. He eventually found work as a shift manager at an electronics store. From time to time, he created new email accounts and sent messages alternating between desperate requests for a loan and furious accusations that I had ruined his life. I built a custom filter that identified his writing patterns and routed the messages directly into a digital incinerator. I never read them. The greatest change was not financial. It was the silence inside my mind. For 28 years, I had been conditioned to believe I was responsible for my family's happiness. I had been taught that boundaries were selfish and that my success had value only when they could benefit from it. Breaking that conditioning was more difficult than selling either house. Sometimes, you must become the villain in someone else's version of events to become the hero of your own life. I did not merely burn the bridge connecting me to my family. I destroyed the foundation beneath it, crossed to the other side, and built walls strong enough to keep them from following. People often say that forgiveness is necessary for peace. I no longer believe that is always true. Sometimes, peace comes from accountability. Sometimes it comes from walking away without guilt. Sharing DNA with someone does not create an obligation to sacrifice your sanity, your future, or everything you have earned. When people repeatedly offer you poison, you are not required to drink it simply because they call it a family tradition. A few distant relatives still whispered that I had been too ruthless. They argued that selling the house beneath my aging parents went too far, regardless of the forged loan application. They believed family problems should always be solved privately. But I knew what would have happened if I had remained silent. I would have been trapped beneath hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent debt. I might have lost my credit, my career, and the future I had spent years building. I would have been living in a small apartment while my parents and brother celebrated inside my beach house. They had mistaken silence for weakness. They learned too late that sometimes silence is only the calm before the storm.